The wind cut across Narragansett Bay like a blade, carrying with it the salt smell of the Atlantic and the distant thunder of construction. In the pre-dawn darkness, naval engineers stood before a structure that would seem, to the untrained eye, impossibly simple. A half-cylinder of corrugated steel, 36 feet wide, 16 feet high, ribs bent into a perfect arc. No foundation, no complexity, just metal, bolts, and the kind of brutal efficiency that only desperation breeds. One officer, Captain Norman P. Mason, circled the prototype with a measuring tape and a stopwatch, his breath fogging in the January cold. The structure had gone up in less than a day. He knew what that meant. He knew what was coming. 7 weeks earlier, Pearl Harbor had burned. The Pacific had become a graveyard. And America, unprepared, underarmed, scrambling to mobilize a peacetime economy into a war machine, faced a problem that couldn't be solved with courage or rhetoric alone. You cannot fight a global war without infrastructure. You cannot supply millions of soldiers across 2 oceans without warehouses, without barracks, without hospitals, without command centers. And you cannot build those structures using traditional methods when every lumber mill, every construction crew, every carpenter is already stretched beyond capacity. The military needed buildings. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. They needed them in Alaska and Australia, in North Africa and the Aleutians, in jungles and deserts and frozen tundra. They needed them yesterday. What Captain Mason was staring at that morning was not just a hut. It was the solution to an impossible equation. Before the war, American military construction followed the old rhythms: wood frame barracks, concrete hangars, stone fortifications, structures designed to last, built with patience and craft, erected by skilled labor over weeks or months. But when war erupted across the globe in 1939, and when the inevitability of American involvement became undeniable, the Pentagon began to understand the scale of the coming storm. Planners ran the numbers. If America entered the war, it would need to house and supply 10 million servicemen. It would need facilities in climates ranging from subarctic to equatorial. It would need buildings that could be transported across oceans, assembled by men with minimal training, and erected on terrain that ranged from solid rock to swampland. And it would need all of this to happen faster than any construction program in human history. Traditional building methods were dead on arrival. Even prefabricated wooden structures, already in use at some bases, required too much lumber, too much transport tonnage, too much time. Lumber was a strategic resource. Ships were a strategic resource. Time was the ultimate strategic resource. So in early 1941, nearly a year before Pearl Harbor, the Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks began hunting for alternatives. They looked at British Nissen huts, semi-cylindrical structures made of corrugated iron, developed during World War I, simple, portable, but flawed. The Nissen hut was cold, poorly insulated, prone to condensation, and its curved shape wasted interior space. It was a temporary shelter, not a functional building. What the Navy needed was something better, something American. The work began at Quonset Point Naval Air Station, a windswept corner of Rhode Island coastline where the Navy had established a construction battalion training center. The facility's name would lend itself to history. George A. Fuller Company, a civilian contractor with experience in modular construction, was brought in to solve the riddle. The design team was small, fewer than a dozen engineers and architects, but they worked with the urgency of men who understood the stakes. They studied the Nissen hut and discarded its weaknesses. They studied shipping constraints and assembly logistics. They studied climates and load-bearing requirements. And by the summer of 1941, they had their answer. The Quonset hut was born from simplicity and mass production. Its skeleton was a series of steel arches, prefabricated, interchangeable, requiring only bolts for assembly. Its skin was corrugated steel panels, lightweight but strong, resistant to weather and impact. The floor could be wood or concrete, depending on need. The structure came in two primary sizes, a 16 by 36-foot model for storage and a larger 20 by 48-foot variant for housing or workspace. Every component was standardized. Every piece could be manufactured in bulk, packed flat, shipped efficiently, and assembled without specialized tools. A crew of 10 men could erect a Quonset hut in a single day. In ideal conditions, experienced teams could do it in hours. But the true genius was not in the design. It was in the system. The Quonset hut was not a building. It was a module, a unit of infrastructure that could be produced, transported, and deployed like ammunition. You could cluster them into bases. You could line them up into hospitals. You could stack supplies in them, repair aircraft inside them, sleep 100 men in them. They were indestructible in the way that crude tools are indestructible, not through sophistication, but through the absence of vulnerability. There was nothing to break because there was nothing complex enough to fail. The Navy ordered the first production run in late 1941. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and the order became infinite. By mid-1942, Quonset huts were rolling off assembly lines in Providence, Rhode Island, in quantities that defied comprehension. Factories that had once produced plumbing fixtures and steel girders retooled to stamp out arched ribs and corrugated panels. The structures moved through ports in crates and onto cargo ships bound for every theater of war. They arrived in Iceland and Iran, in New Guinea and Newfoundland, in Italy and Iwo Jima. By the war's end, more than 170,000 Quonset huts had been manufactured, a figure that still fails to capture the scale of their deployment. When you counted British-produced variants, Commonwealth offshoots, and field modifications, the number climbed closer to 500,000. To soldiers arriving at forward bases, the Quonset hut became a symbol, not of comfort, but of presence, of American reach. A Marine landing on Guadalcanal in August 1942 found himself sleeping in a hut erected while the island was still being cleared of Japanese stragglers. An Army Air Force mechanic in North Africa worked 12-hour shifts inside huts that kept sandstorms at bay. A Navy corpsman in the Aleutians ran a field hospital from huts bolted to permafrost, where temperatures dropped to 30 below zero and the wind howled like artillery. The structures were everywhere. They were the architecture of American logistics, but they were not loved. Not at first. Soldiers called them half-pipes and steel igloos. In tropical climates, they became ovens, the corrugated metal radiating heat until the interior felt like a blast furnace. In Arctic climates, they became iceboxes, the thin walls offering minimal insulation against sub-zero winds. Condensation dripped from the ceilings. Mold grew in corners. Rats nested in the crawl spaces. The huts were functional, but they were not comfortable. And yet, soldiers learned to adapt. They lined the interiors with wood paneling scavenged from crates. They rigged ventilation systems from surplus aircraft parts. They insulated with sandbags and canvas tarps. The Quonset hut became what you made of it. And what America made of it was a supply line that could not be broken. The German military understood logistics. The Wehrmacht had pioneered blitzkrieg, a doctrine built on speed, mobility, and the rapid consolidation of captured infrastructure. But even the Germans, with their meticulous planning, could not match the scale of American construction in the field. When Rommel's Afrika Korps retreated across Libya in 1943, they left behind supply depots hastily assembled from tents and improvised shelters, structures that collapsed in sandstorms or disintegrated under Allied bombing. By contrast, the American forces that pursued them erected Quonset huts in their wake, transforming desert wastelands into functioning air bases within days. German POWs, captured during the North African campaigns, were processed through Quonset hut detention centers. They ate in Quonset mess halls. They were interrogated in Quonset command posts. The huts became a visible manifestation of something the Axis powers had underestimated: American industrial capacity. Japan faced the same revelation in the Pacific. In the early months of the war, Japanese forces had swept across Southeast Asia with stunning speed, capturing British and Dutch colonial infrastructure. But those facilities were static, tied to fixed locations, vulnerable to bombardment. When the United States began its island-hopping campaign, it brought its infrastructure with it. A captured island would be a barren strip of coral and jungle on Monday. By Friday, it would have fuel depots, ammunition dumps, repair hangars, and hospitals, all housed in Quonset huts shipped from Pearl Harbor or Australia or San Diego. Japanese commanders reading intelligence reports struggled to comprehend the speed of American construction. One captured document, recovered from a headquarters on Saipan in 1944, expressed disbelief at the pace of American base establishment. The writer estimated it would take months to build such facilities. The Americans had done it in days. This was not magic. This was manufacturing. This was standardization. This was the assembly line applied to war. The soldiers who lived in these huts understood, in a way their commanders could not, what the structures represented. They were ugly. They were cold in winter and hot in summer. But they were there, always there. A soldier wounded in the Philippines would wake in a Quonset hospital. An airman shot down over Germany and repatriated would be debriefed in a Quonset intelligence center. A Marine rotating off the front lines at Okinawa would eat hot food in a Quonset mess hall. The huts were the connective tissue of the American war effort. They were proof that no matter how far you went, no matter how hostile the terrain, the United States could build a base. And to the enemy, that was terrifying. Not the huts themselves. Any nation could manufacture steel shelters. But the system behind them, the production capacity, the shipping network, the ability to deliver thousands of tons of prefabricated infrastructure to the far side of the planet and assemble it faster than the enemy could destroy it. The Quonset hut was a symbol, but what it symbolized was abundance, industrial overkill, the grinding, relentless, inexhaustible power of an economy that could outbuild, outsupply, outsustain any adversary. Captured German officers, interrogated in England in 1944, often expressed grudging admiration for Allied logistics. One Luftwaffe colonel, questioned about why the German air campaign had failed, pointed to airfield construction. The British and Americans, he said, could rebuild a bombed runway in hours. They could replace destroyed hangars overnight. "You are not fighting a military," he said. "You are fighting a factory." He was right, and the factory's product was victory packaged in corrugated steel and shipped worldwide. The true test of the Quonset hut came not in temperate climates or well-supplied rear areas, but in the places where nature itself was the enemy. In the Aleutian Islands, where American forces established bases to counter the Japanese occupation of Attu and Kiska, temperatures dropped to 40 below zero and winds reached hurricane force. Traditional wooden structures shattered under the strain. Quonset huts, anchored to bedrock and weighted with sandbags, endured. They flexed in the wind. They shed snow. They did not break. Soldiers lived in them for months, heated by pot-belly stoves that glowed red-hot, the interiors dense with cigarette smoke and the smell of wet wool. The huts were miserable, but they were habitable, and in the Aleutians, that was the difference between survival and death. In the South Pacific, the opposite problem arose: heat, humidity, jungle rot. The Quonset huts transported to islands like New Georgia and Bougainville arrived in crates green with mildew. Soldiers assembled them in clearings hacked from the rainforest, the steel ribs slick with condensation before the panels were even bolted on. Inside, the temperature could reach 120 degrees. Men worked shirtless, their skin slick with sweat, their hands blistering on sun-heated metal. Malaria and dysentery ravaged the camps, but the huts held. They housed field hospitals where doctors performed surgeries by flashlight. They stored medical supplies that would have rotted in tents. They provided shelter during monsoons that turned the jungle into a swamp. And in Europe, after D-Day, Quonset huts followed the Allied advance across France. They appeared in Normandy within days of the invasion, erected on captured German airfields. They spread across Belgium and into Germany itself. When the Battle of the Bulge erupted in December 1944 and the front collapsed into chaos, it was Quonset huts, erected behind the lines, that served as triage stations, command posts, and supply depots. The Germans, retreating through the snow, left behind a trail of burned villages and destroyed infrastructure. The Americans, advancing through the same snow, left behind a trail of steel huts. There was a moment, recorded in a letter written by a young engineer named Harold Ickes Jr., stationed in Belgium in early 1945, that captured the strange poetry of the Quonset hut. He described standing outside a hut at dusk, listening to the sounds inside, typewriters clacking, radios crackling, men laughing over a poker game. It was, he wrote, the sound of normalcy, the sound of America, transplanted to a foreign land. We carry our country with us, he wrote, not in flags or speeches, but in these ugly metal sheds. Inside them, we are home. That was the unspoken truth of the Quonset hut. It was not beautiful, it was not grand, but it was familiar. To a soldier 10,000 miles from home, the hut was a constant. Every base had them, every camp, every airfield. They were the same in Alaska and Australia, in Italy and India. You could walk into a Quonset hut in any theater of war and know, immediately, where the light switch was, where the stove would be, how the bunks were arranged. That predictability, that standardization, was a form of psychological infrastructure. It reduced uncertainty. It created order. And in war, order is a weapon. The war ended. The factories stopped, but the Quonset huts remained. In Europe, they became housing for displaced persons, shelters for refugees fleeing Soviet occupation. In Japan, they served as headquarters for the occupation forces, administrative centers where MacArthur's staff processed the reconstruction of a shattered empire. In the Pacific, they were abandoned on dozens of islands, rusting monuments to a vanished war, slowly consumed by jungle and salt air. But in the United States, the huts found a second life. Returning veterans facing a housing shortage bought surplus Quonset huts for a few $100s and converted them into homes. They appeared in suburbs and on farms, their interiors paneled with plywood, their curved ceilings painted white. They became churches and workshops, storage sheds and roadside diners. They were ubiquitous and invisible, part of the landscape of post-war America. By the 1950s, the original Quonset huts were being phased out of military use, replaced by more sophisticated modular buildings. But the concept endured. The idea that infrastructure could be mass-produced, transported, and assembled at speed, that idea became doctrine. It shaped the design of Cold War military bases. It influenced civilian construction. It laid the groundwork for the modular architecture that would dominate disaster relief and expeditionary operations in the decades to come. The Quonset hut was obsolete, but its legacy was permanent. There's a photograph, taken in the spring of 1945, that survives in the archives of the National Museum of the Pacific War. It shows a Quonset hut on Okinawa, its steel panels pocked with shrapnel scars, a jagged hole torn through the roof by Japanese mortar fire. Soldiers had patched the hole with a piece of canvas and continued using the structure. The photograph was not staged. It was not propaganda. It was simply documentation. But it tells the story better than any official report. The Quonset hut was not indestructible because it could not be destroyed. It was indestructible because it could be replaced. Because there were always more. Because the factories back home could produce them faster than the enemy could eliminate them. That was the real solution to America's supply line crisis. Not a miracle of engineering. Not a stroke of genius. Just math. Just industry. Just the cold, relentless logic of mass production applied to the machinery of war. When German soldiers surrendered in Italy, they were processed through Quonset huts. When Japanese officers signed surrender documents aboard the USS Missouri, they returned to shore and were escorted to Quonset hut headquarters. The huts were there at the beginning, when the war seemed impossible. They were there at the end, when the impossible had been achieved. They were the architecture of victory, not because they were strong, but because they were everywhere. In the years after the war, historians would debate the turning points. Midway, Stalingrad, Normandy. But the soldiers who fought the war, who lived in the huts and worked in the huts and bled in the huts, understood a different truth. Wars are not won by battles. Wars are won by supply lines, by logistics, by the unglamorous, grinding work of keeping millions of men fed, armed, sheltered, and moving forward. The Quonset hut was not a weapon, but it was a tool. And in the hands of a nation with the industrial capacity to produce 170,000 of them, it became something more. It became proof. Proof that democracy, for all its inefficiencies, could outproduce tyranny. Proof that free labor, motivated by wages and purpose, could outwork slave labor driven by fear. Proof that a society built on abundance, on the belief that resources should be deployed without hesitation, could overwhelm an enemy built on scarcity. The huts were ugly. They were temporary, but they were infinite. And infinity in war is unstoppable. Today, a few Quonset huts still stand. On decommissioned military bases, they rust quietly, overtaken by weeds. In rural communities, they serve as barns or storage units, their origins forgotten. In museums, restored examples are displayed alongside tanks and aircraft, relics of a vanished conflict. But the huts themselves are not the point. The point is what they represented. The point is the system that produced them. The point is the supply line that could not be broken. Because the Axis powers built their empires on the belief that willpower and discipline could overcome material disadvantage. They believed that superior tactics and ideology could defeat industrial superiority. They were wrong. And the Quonset hut, simple, portable, indestructible, was the proof of their error. It was not a symbol of American strength. It was the strength itself, stamped in steel, shipped across oceans, and erected in the ruins of a world at war. When Captain Mason stood in that Rhode Island dawn in January 1942, staring at the prototype, he could not have known the scale of what was coming. He could not have imagined the huts stretching across continents, dotting the Pacific like breadcrumbs, rising in the deserts and jungles and frozen wastes. But he knew enough. He knew that the structure before him was not just a building. It was a promise that America would be there, everywhere, always. And in the end, that promise was kept.